What can recent events teach us about securing our data?
I'm Alyssa Blackburn.
I'm Mike Loader. TechEdge starts now. Hello everyone, welcome to TechEdge, presented by AvePoint, where each episode we delve into the latest industry trends for business, IT, and of course their significance in today's ever-changing landscape. Now in this episode, we unpack what Crowdstrike can teach you about data security and ways to avoid those data disasters. It's wonderful to have you with me, Alyssa. Huge.
Look, this was a really significant thing, but do you know what my favourite thing about it was? Is it took down all of my working applications and I couldn't do anything for a day.
Oh no.
I had to sit and watch my computer with the blue screen of death while I couldn't do anything, and I certainly wasn't the only one impacted, and this was
Huge.
a really significant thing on a global scale, and lots of learnings for organisations out of this one, most definitely.
Well, let's get into it. And our guest today you've brought to the table?
Dan Weis, who is the practice lead at Nexon. Dan, thank you so much for joining us. Can you just start by telling us, for those who might have missed it, the one person out there who did, the CrowdStrike outage. What happened and how did it impact organisations worldwide?
Firstly, thanks for having me on the show, guys. So CrowdStrike is one of the biggest security companies in the world and mainly supply what we call endpoint protection or EDR or sometimes XDR software. We used to call this antivirus in the old days. They also provide what we call SOC as well as detection and other response capabilities. Now, on the 19th of July, they pushed out a configuration update for their Windows Sensor product, which basically didn't play very nice with Windows, blue screening around about 8.5 million Windows machines, around 1% of all Windows systems around the world. This, of course, impacted both servers and end user devices. This heavily impacted nearly every industry around the globe. It shut down a large number of flights and airports, as an example. It affected hospitals, it affected retailers and supermarkets, as well as payment processing and banks here in Australia, affecting people's ability to obviously pay and process payments. And what this event highlighted to organisations was that not all threats come from cyber attacks, and just how dependent we are on all these services in our everyday life.
Absolutely, and of course there was all of that noise going, oh, is it a cyber hack, is it an attack, what's going on? But at first the news around the world was mentioning all of this. Are there similarities between what we saw and of course sort of negative threat actors out there?
Absolutely, there are similarities, and it makes sense that the rumours straight away said that it was a cyber attack. I'll say it again, it was not a cyber attack. we have had a large number of supply chain attacks and breaches in the past. For example, there was the SolarWinds attack back in 2020, we had the Kaseya attack back in 2021, and then we had the MOVEit attacks back in 2023. In these attacks, the vendor's software was compromised and then used to attack all the organizations that it was running on, which has a similar architectural design and distribution method as what we were seeing with the CrowdStrike Falcon product. If this was a cyber attack, instead of an update issue, as we've now seen just how large CrowdStrike is, it would have been one of the biggest supply chain breaches in history. Thankfully, it wasn't.
Absolutely. Dan, was there an opportunity here, or did potential attackers capitalise on this event?
They absolutely did. And with the adoption of AI, it allows attackers to quickly generate phishing and other attacks on the fly, in line with current events happening in the world. So within hours, we saw fake CrowdStrike installer fixes, basically malware, made available online from attackers. And we saw phishing websites and emails hitting organizations capitalizing on the event, which is something that's very common, and all organizations should prepare for these types of attacks after any major incident like this. Attackers will definitely be straight onto it as soon as it happens.
It certainly doesn't take much these days for a bad actor or cyber attacker to just get right in there.
Their fingers are on the pulse just as much as the good actors. So how can organisations prevent similar incidents affecting their business operations? I know that's sort of a tall order, I think, for people who are depending on this kind of software or platforms, if you will.
So if we look at this from both a cybersecurity and an IT perspective, firstly, it's important that organisations define their risk tolerance. That is the actual amount of risk or impact that an organisation is willing to accept in pursuit of their goals or objectives. Then the organisation needs to identify their critical dependencies and assets, and most importantly, what that organisation's supply chain is. Then you need to be vetting your supply chain, making sure you have assessed their security posture and done your due diligence to ensure that they are as secure as they can be, and also to understand how they continue in the event of an outage, okay, their resilience as well. Another area to touch on here is that you may have direct supply chains, but what about indirect supply chains? For example, in the Crowdstrike outage, most airports and a large number of transport companies were taken offline. So what happens if your organization relies on, say, materials being manufactured and moved? Well, then this outage will then impact that. So now we're talking about this contingency planning. And with that said, it's a good idea to ensure you have redundancy across all of your systems so that if something fails, another system can take over. Remove those single points of failure. Consider building some diversity from different vendors to minimize this risk. And also consider geographically diverse systems as well for additional resilience. I know it's old school, but it might be worth considering having another solution in the event of your tools being offline. Or your systems being offline. I'm going to show my age for a minute. I don't know if you guys remember, but when I was growing up, if the FPOS payment system went down, we had a credit card imprinter to swipe a copy of your card onto a paper slip, right? Which was processed later on when things were back online. And
Dan,
this is just
I was just thinking about that, and I was thinking to myself, actually, I probably can't mention that because Mike won't know what I'm talking about. But I'm so glad you and I have that shared connection, definitely. But you're absolutely right. There was a contingency.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's just a really basic example of removing over-reliance, or at least planning for your tool sets to be offline and for your organization having to resort to those manual workarounds. Then, of course, ensuring your organization has a disaster recovery plan and a business continuity planning in place as well to ensure that you can quickly and effectively respond, restore, and continue operations during and after an incident, whether it be a cyber attack or an IT outage, and that this plan is obviously tested at a minimum of annually, and then those lessons learned and the plan refined after that. Next up, covering off the cybersecurity front. So talking about taking a layered approach to cybersecurity, encompassing local security controls. We still need to have endpoint protection and application whitelisting and lockdown devices, patched and maintained systems, all these technical controls, network security controls, as well as ensuring that you have sufficient detection and response capabilities to actually detect when an attack is underway and for later forensics. A lack of visibility and response is one of the biggest challenges that I find facing most organizations today. And the last point is making sure that you are firstly undertaking regular security testing, such as penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, audits, these sorts of things. It's also a good idea to perform what we call a data inventory. So again, another big risk area for organizations is understanding what data they hold and use and what could be exposed or made offline in the event of an incident. So every organization generally stores way too much data, which can inadvertently or deliberately be exposed in a number of different types of events. Organizations really need to be asking themselves, do we need to keep that data or purge it? Why are we keeping that data? What is it being used for? And most importantly, what information or data does our third parties hold and, of course, have access to as well?
Dan, just to finish, what role does incident response planning play in minimising the impact of these unexpected outages? And I guess what steps should organisations take to make sure their security tools don't inadvertently cause issues?
Yeah, so having an incident response plan is absolutely critical in the event of an outage or a cybersecurity incident. Organisations should ensure they have a defined and tested incident response plan for events, and that a simulated test is performed every year, and that this plan should not only cover the incident response team and which events warrant standing up of that team, but of course any actions and activities, including communication protocols for communicating with affected customers and the wider public. If we take the Crowdstrike event as an example, they had a very good level of comms and updates. They took accountability, they were clear, transparent, empathetic, and they have handled the PR and response to customers really, really well. If you are a software development or a software company, and even if you're just an end user organization, you should have what we call staging environments in place and test any updates before rolling them out more widely. For development houses, this includes things like local testing, content update and rollback testing, user testing, such as stress testing and fault injection, stability testing. All these things should be included in what they call their development life cycle. For end users and organizations and businesses, have a defined patch management process for testing and deployment of both apps, signatures, and operating system updates, and obviously deploying to a test group first before rolling out to the wider server and device fleet. Thereby, if an event goes sour, like what happened with CrowdStrike, well, then the results is greatly reduced and the impact is greatly reduced.
Yeah, somebody said to me once, prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. And I took that to heart.
You're absolutely right. One of the things I think is really interesting about a number of the discussions that we've had both today and in previous episodes is coming back to the amount of data that organisations hold on to that they don't necessarily need to, and this keeps coming up as a recurring theme. Now, while I don't think that was, obviously that was not the cause of the CrowdStrike issue, but it's just one of those things that organisations really need to get a handle on and really need to start to take control over. So Dan, just in your sort of final words, what is the thing that organisations can learn from this? What is it that they should be focusing on in this space?
Firstly, I would say would be just removing these single points of failure and having some backup plans and processes in place. We saw so many organizations that just stopped completely. We saw hospitals that couldn't take in patients. They were sending them elsewhere. There was no kind of contingency planning in place for such an event. And I think the biggest takeaway for organizations is have some contingency planning in place. Plan for this in your disaster recovery, and of course, in your general organizational planning that something like this will happen and that it's not always a cyber attack. And of course, treat outages like this the same as you would potential cyber attacks as well. So there's a lot of similarities and they both have big impacts. They can both happen. And I think redundancy and resilience will be absolutely key here.
Dan, very well said by you, and thank you for joining us on the program, highlighting a little bit more about this major event that happened and, of course, the flow-on effect of what people can do to mitigate that risk moving forward.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks, Dan. Dan's words there, and your words too, Mike. Plan.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he just said.
A kind of the summary. People can just...
Exactly. That's all you need. Plan, everyone. Get on it.
Guys, thanks so much for joining us on the program. Hopefully you've learned something from our discussion, and of course we'll be here keeping an eye on all of the latest right here on Ticker. Be well.
You're watching Ticker. We'll have more in just a few minutes.